Thank you. We're back on item 10A. Ms. Crocker.
Kit Crocker, CalPERS Investment Office staff. Item 10A is a first reading of staff's proposed updates to the private equity and real assets program policies arising out of this year's annual reviews. For private equity, staff proposes to amend the definition of customized investment account in terms of the elements to be considered in selecting the GP. Now, the problem here is with the implication that this is an exhaustive list. We're not proposing eliminating the requirement of appropriate expertise. It's simply the point that to provide a partial list is too restrictive and implies that other forms of expertise might not be considered validly. As regards the real assets program policy, there are two primary substantive changes. First, the expression of staff's authority at the program level, that is to say, at the real assets program level rather than at each of the three individual portfolio levels. And second, the proposed relocation of the program-specific leverage constraints to policy-related procedures. This is consistent with the centralization of leverage management at the total fund level, already, I think, blessed in concept by the board at the September IC. Now, since this is a first reading, we're looking for input from the committee, so I will pause there and ask if, invite Wilshire to comment.
Thank you. Tom Tote with Wilshire Associates. I'll just make a couple of comments on the substantive changes. And first, to start with the definition of the customized investment account, I think it's very important to emphasize that this is not meant to soften the underwriting standards for those investment implementation vehicles. It's really to provide more flexibility in terms of the facets which are considered when deciding whether or not a customized investment account is appropriate. One example I thought it'd be helpful to bring forward for a facet which is not in the industry geographic or style expertise list is strong deal flow. You might look for a manager that brings interesting or attractive deals to the table. So that's just one example of a facet which is not included there. So I think that's important to point out. I think the key word as we talk about some of the other changes is implementation flexibility. That's really what you're looking to provide in order to ultimately enhance returns. So that's what's behind the changes in the delegated limits, including all of them in one aggregate level, and then allowing staff to decide where to implement on a cumulative basis those commitments across the underlying portfolios, whether that be in real estate or whether that be in infrastructure. And then lastly, the adjustment or the removal of the leverage limits constraints. I think the important point there is that this really is maintaining the status quo. The limits which are being moved from the policy into the PRPs remain the same. So we don't expect that to have an impact on the strategic risk level of the implementation of those parts of the portfolio. So all of that said, we're comfortable with the changes and would appreciate any feedback that the investment committee has to provide.
Thank you. Ms. Yee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the explanation about the revision with respect to the customized investment account GPs. And I guess since this is first reading, I wanted to just ask if you could just go back and kind of read it to be sure it really kind of highlights that this is not at the expense of expertise and experience, and that this is really more for flexibility. Because I think the way I read it, and I'm happy to go back and read it again, but it just seemed like it left me thinking, why wouldn't we want to have the most experienced, people working with us, and regardless of the PPO. And so if we could just kind of review that for maybe tone or emphasis, I would appreciate that.
Yes, happy to.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Jones.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, my question is on attachment 2, page 4 of 8. and it's the removal of the staff shall report concerns, problems, material changes, et cetera, to the committee as soon as possible, or at least at the next committee meeting. It's deleted. Where did it go?
Yes, we've been in the process of removing the redundant references to that requirement from the program policies, as we discussed, I think. It is now going to exist solely in the total fund. So there's one expression of that requirement, and it exists in the total fund investment policy.
Okay, so the policy didn't change. It's just being moved.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brown.
Thank you. I knew that was your answer to that question I was going to ask, the same as Mr. Jones. And then I do want to piggyback on what Controller Yee said, which is when I read it, it looked like we were saying we weren't focused on expertise or experience or special skills. And so it looked like, why are we saying we don't need that? So let's take a look at how that's worded. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Oliveros.
Thank you. I want to understand more about the customized investment, or the CIA, customized investment account, and what's happening with not focusing on just those funds that are top quartile.
I'll take a first stab at that, Ms. Oliveros. I think the primary goal there is not to limit the opportunity set to those that have had top quartile returns. The idea being that by limiting it to those who have done well, you might miss out on opportunities for managers who are going to do well going forward. So while the performance track record is absolutely going to continue to be a part of the due diligence process, by not the goal of eliminating that statement is not to just focus attention on those who have done well in the past.
I understand that, but does that also leave room to go after bottom quartile? Or is there some type of safety mechanism around that?
So it does leave room because you are eliminating that, but I think it's important to point out that the due diligence and the underwriting that the team goes through is undoubtedly going to continue to utilize the track record and the results as part of the due diligence process, but not by policy limiting it to top quartile managers.
So the request is to have the policy read basically that we could pursue a fund regardless of quartile.
Past quartile rankings. That's right.
And how is that handled by other pensions?
I think the way I would describe it, and I'd be happy to get input from the other consultants and staff, past performance is always going to be part of the underwriting and the due diligence process, and the attribution of how any private equity group or private real asset group has driven results, who's responsible for it, over what time period, what did the market environment look like when that was done. And so I think that is still going to be part of the process, but it's just not predefining what the universe is going to start with, just those top quartile managers.
So I'd like to better understand the risks associated with this. So assuming we have the highest performing team possible, due diligence was done perfectly, what are the risks if that's not in place?
I think implementation of private equity and private real assets is the difference between success and failure, candidly. The median return for a private equity manager is not materially different from what you would get in public markets. So implementation is absolutely key. So I think having a strong team in place is going to be one of the critical drivers of success for the portfolio.
I'm sorry, I should clarify in terms of changing the policy. So if the policy is changing from focusing on funds that have had top quartile returns and eliminating that portion, so no quartile is being targeted, we could go to bottom quartile. What are the risks associated with that policy change?
I don't think there's an increase in risk associated with that policy change because, as we oftentimes see, those better performing managers have some mean reversion, or they get too big for their own good, so to speak, and therefore don't necessarily provide the same level of returns that they had in the past. So again, I think it comes back to the diligent underwriting standards that the team brings to bear when evaluating the opportunity set. And again, keeping in mind that part of that diligence incorporates analysis of the track record. So this isn't to say that track record no longer matters. It's just not a limiting point for the initial universe.
Would you recommend additional language or safeguards around this change in policy?
I think this is sufficient. And one other point which hasn't been made, and it's mentioned, I think, in both Makita's opinion piece as well as in the staff's, is that each of these opportunities comes along with a prudent person opinion, so another set of eyes, so to speak, on the establishment of these types of implementation vehicles. So that's another safeguard to your point about what does this do to the risk of implementation within private equity.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you. Seeing no other requests, anything else? Ms. Crocker? Okay, thank you. Brings us to agenda item 11. 11A is the affiliate trust. Mr. Meng.
Yes, Mr. Chair. So this is about the fixed income benchmark update for the affiliates funds. With that, I will call my colleague Eric Baxton and Christine Rees.
Just a second before we go there. Mr. Darby had requested item 10A. I'm sorry, I missed that. Mr. Darby, please come forward.
Al Darby, President, RPEA. I preface this session with the statement that I have consulted an expert in CalPERS investing to elicit this response related to the current item of discussion. One of the provisions, I believe it's in attachment 2, eliminates the number 2 provision, which is staff shall report concerns, problems, material changes, and all violations of policy. These reports shall include explanations of any violations and appropriate recommendations for corrective action at the next committee meeting or sooner if deemed necessary. And that has been replaced with less stringent language, and it further eliminates or diminishes board oversight. So again, this is an issue of these proposals that continue to erode board oversight in the actions of the staff. Thank you.
Thank you. 11B, please, or 11A, I'm sorry.
Okay, good morning, Eric
Before you
Baggeson.
start, I have Mr. Jones wants to make a comment.
Yes, I think it's important, Mr. Chair, that that question that Mr. Darby raised about it being eliminated, that question was raised a few minutes ago, and it was responded that it was not being eliminated, it's being moved to another section.
Correct. I think we all heard that more than once today, that it's just been moved to the total fund performance, not individual, so we eliminate the redundancy. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, Eric Baggeson, Managing Investment Director for Trust Level Portfolio Management. Agenda item 11A is an information item that seeks to provide the board with a bit of understanding about how some benchmark changes that were made to the CalPERS fixed income benchmark in relation to the PERF, the Public Employees Retirement Fund, and those changes were made this past summer. There's implications for some of those benchmark changes because we actually have shared benchmarks that exist not only for the PERF, but are also used for some of the affiliate funds. So my colleague Christine Rees, a investment director within the Global Equity Program, will get into a few of the specifics about that. But the other point that I wanted to make in relation to this agenda item was that this item was created really at the advice of Wilshire Associates. And Wilshire is demonstrating, in essence, their oversight or their judgment about what types of items need to be brought to the board. And this was a question that came up this past, I think 2 board meetings ago. A question was asked about how Wilshire uses their judgment and when do they choose to bring information or make the board aware of a body of information that they think is important for this board to understand. And this is an example, basically, where this agenda item has been created because Wilshire believed that this was a piece of information that you as a board should be aware of. So I wanted to acknowledge that reality. And we have Andrew Junkin here as well from Wilshire Associates, basically, that can answer any questions or provide any other commentary that he has. So I think with that, I'll just turn it over to Christine, though, to go through the specifics.
Thank you, Eric. And good morning, afternoon, I'm not sure exactly where it is, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Christine Reese, CalPERS team member. So as Eric mentioned, this item is to provide you with some information about the affiliate fund's fixed income long liability benchmark. As he mentioned, when the changes were made to the PERF benchmark, this is a shared benchmark, and so those changes were also made to the affiliate funds. At that point, when that was known, we looked to analyze the effect of those changes for the affiliate funds and the appropriateness of that change. And in working with the various investment teams, as well as with Wilshire, we believe that the rationale for the benchmark change applies both to the PERF and the affiliate funds. In the analysis that was performed for the PERF benchmark, both TIPS and agency debt, which are being removed from the benchmark, were found to reduce both liquidity and equity risk diversification. So removal of these 2 asset types should improve both of those measures. The inflation protection element for the affiliate funds will be fully addressed in the TIPS asset class. So each affiliate fund asset allocation has a distinct TIPS asset class. Lastly, I just wanted to say that we have worked closely with Wilshire throughout this process to ensure that this benchmark is appropriate. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Andrew for a few comments.
Thank you. Again, I'll be brief. As Christine covered, this is something that we discussed. Honestly, this came down to a question of materiality. Right, and so we've had some questions, as Eric noted, over the past few months, what rises to the level of materiality. From a risk and return standpoint, this does not rise to the level of materiality because it was a fraction of a segment within the affiliate funds, and the purpose of the inflation protection purpose of having TIPS in the portfolio was already addressed with a separate allocation to TIPS. We just felt it was appropriate to bring this to your attention that this was a follow-on action to the action that you took to remove TIPS and agencies from the global fixed income index and therefore portfolio for the PERF that it follows through to the affiliate funds. So that's it. Not trying to make too big a deal out of it, but it was something that we wanted to have flagged for your attention.
Thank you. Any requests? Seeing no requests. Oh, here we go. Ms. Oliveros.
Sorry, I have one. So I get it's focusing on treasuries, taking out TIPS, taking out agency debt. How does this affect the overall number? Just out of curiosity, what benchmark number do we see now when we exclude those?
I'm not exactly sure I understand the question.
Will this change the benchmark number, right? So I mean, TIPS is obviously lower, so I'm wondering if it will reduce it a certain amount.
In terms of risk and return?
Yes.
So removing TIPS and the agency debt should, and replacing it with treasuries should increase both the return and the risk nominally.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we looked at this at the PERF level, it was maybe a basis point of expected return. So I would call, on a forecasted 10-year basis, so I would call that well within the estimation error window.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Is there no other requests? Thank you very much. Brings us to item 11B. Mr. Meng.
Yes, Mr. Chair, good afternoon, members of the Investment Committee. As you may recall that in 2016, CalPERS adopted the first 5-year strategic plan for sustainable investment. And this agenda item is to give you a progress update to date. And as a long-term investor, climate risk and long-term sustainability for our fund are of paramount concerns to us. Sustainability for CalPERS means repeatability of investment returns. We need those returns to fulfill our fiduciary duty and to pay benefits to millions of Californians, not just every month, but for generations to come. So that's why climate change is an investment issue for us. We also recognize that although we are the largest defined benefit pension fund in the U.S., the scale and complexity of climate change requires that we work together with investors, policymakers, regulators around the world. When compared to our global peers, the reality of our fund imposes additional challenges for us, such as our lower than desired funding status, our 7% return target, and our need to pay out about $24 billion in benefit every year. And not only we have a current liability of about $24 billion a year, it is important to note that the dominant source, about 60 cents of every dollar for that $24 billion, comes from investment returns. We need those investment returns now and in the future. If the market fails us or we miss our targets, the hardworking people of California and the employers take on the financial burden. Thus, everything we do must be 100% aligned with generating the needed returns. As such, we encourage our stakeholders to take our unique challenges into consideration, and at the same time, we would like to assure our stakeholders that everything we do is 100% aligned and we are 100% focused on generating the needed returns. For non-stakeholders, such as outside parties, who do not bear the financial risk of our fund, but advocate using our fund to take actions beyond the scope of our fiduciary duty, and advocate using our fund to advance their agenda, we ask that they respect our fiduciary duty, acknowledge the often mentioned unique challenges we face, and appreciate the fact that even with our constraints and unique challenges, we continue to lead on climate change initiatives on a global scale. We're proud to have co-founded Climate Action 100+, to have released a detailed and comprehensive document on our real estate energy optimization program, to have joined the Net Zero Asset Alliance, and to have released the physical risk of climate change, which we call PROC, which is the first of this kind of report. We are also staunch supporters for the Paris Agreement and carbon pricing. The list of our accomplishments and the examples of our global leadership do not stop here, and will continue our work in engaging and advocating. But given our fiduciary duty and the unique challenges we face, we cannot and we do not compromise on our investment underwriting, nor will we constrain ourselves to a limited set of investment opportunities. So with that, providing a context, I will turn over to my colleague Ann Simpson, Beth, and Samiso to discuss the agenda item.
Good, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben and Simpson. CalPERS. My first request, as showing our teamwork, is for Ben to pass the clicker down. There you are. This is how we work together. Thank you. So, good morning. I think we're still in the morning, board members. This is the midway point of the CalPERS strategic plan on sustainability. And given that we have so many new board members, a few for whom this is a trip down memory lane, we thought today it would be helpful to recap how the strategic plan got put together, how the priorities were selected, what the evidence was that this is how we achieve our risk-adjusted returns, and give you a progress report on two of the highlights, one being climate change referencing Ben's comments, and also diversity and inclusion. Now, there's a lot more, so what we've done is embed some links into the agenda item so that you can look at the wonderful progress on integration, which Beth is leading, other areas of work which Sumiso is leading, and also learn more about the policy and advocacy. So, these are our topics in this item. We'll have a quick overview of the strategic plan itself. We're also going to introduce a new organizational structure that has been adopted, which has been intended to strengthen the execution of the priorities that the board agreed. The update, and then we'll finish just by looking at the question of partnerships. As Ben said earlier, we aren't in a position to lift all issues on our own. We have to work with others. We may be a big fund, but it's really in partnership that we make progress. So how did we begin? CalPERS' understanding of the importance on sustainability really goes back a very long way. Back in 2011, the board could see there was a lot of activity in this arena, and the first thing to do was some stock taking. And actually, by appointing a consultant, looked at the total fund and everything that was going on that could be badged as something around the theme of sustainability. And I remember well that the number that the consultant came up with was 111. There were 111 different good things going on. Some of them were statements, some of them were portfolios, some of them were promises on capital allocation, guidelines, principles, voting, campaigns. It was a lot. So it seemed that the important thing to do was, looking across all of this activity, is decide, well, what of this really matters for CalPERS, for our fiduciary duty? What's really going to have relevance for risk? What's really going to have an impact on return? And this is obviously quite a few years ago now, but we decided to take the bold step that what we needed to do was have an independent review of the academic evidence. And we called this the Sustainable Investment Research Initiative, or we called it SIRI for short. And I think Apple forgives us, but I do think we got there first. So the SIRI, which is on the website, and you can take a look at the papers, used a team of academics based in Columbia and also nearby at UC Davis, finance professors chiefly, to look at the great range of research that had been published in respectable academic journals. We took the decision not to look at material from the market because there's always some influence there. We thought we've got to be very rigorous. So the SIRI review covered nearly 1,000 papers, and that highlighted a number of areas that either were very consistent with the risk and return objectives of CalPERS, or had some suggested areas for us to work on, and some areas where it really wasn't clear whether we had the data to take a position. But there was some insight from our own experience and some leading examples where we thought we could move forwards. And it was in that spirit of wanting to be based on evidence, wanting to be grounded in economics, that the board really began to think about developing a strategy. The work that we did through the famous SIRI fed into the investment beliefs and really helped the board craft the language around sustainability that you'll find in the investment beliefs. And also, it helped us take a big overhaul of what were then over 100 pages of the CalPERS governance principles. Through that process, we brought them down to around 30 pages, a little more reasonable to get through, and also structured them around what we'd found in this research review. So what happened next? Well, you'll like the old-fashioned light bulb. Of course, this is an Edison light bulb. That's very, very old now. We're all on LEDs, but the plan development began, and it went through an iterative process of workshops, discussions, board meetings, and input with the board. The plan was developed in 2015. That was an important year for CalPERS because it's also the year of the Paris Agreement. And the plan was then approved in August of 2016. And actually, CalPERS won a big prize for doing this work because at that stage, we were the only, if not one of very few plans, which had decided to adopt a strategy. Why does that matter? Well, a strategy says you have to identify your goals. It also has key performance indicators. It has timelines and check-in points where you're going to course correct and make changes of, based on what you've learned as you've gone along. So I think we won the Responsible Investor Global Award for Industry Leadership and Innovation for adopting the plan, which CalPERS was very proud of. 2019, earlier this year, Beth and Samiso gave you an update, which we've given you a link to in March. And the 5-year plan that we have is intended for the key KPIs for the 5 years to be all completed. Some of them are very demanding, but I think we're in good shape. Some of the issues that we're dealing with go much further out than 5 years. Climate change is a good example. But this round of the plan, we feel confident across the team that we're on track for all of the performance indicators that the plan includes. And we'll all be very glad to give you more insight on that in a moment if you have questions. So let's come back to the investment beliefs. Why do these matter? This is really what I see as our compass. It doesn't make decisions, it doesn't tell us where to go, but these beliefs guide the investment office in the direction that we need to take, navigating extremely, I would say, treacherous times ahead of us in the financial markets, with volatile markets, with a 7% discount rate at around 70% funding. And when I came in this morning, I was struck that we have a new version of the pension buck. And for me, this really sums it all up beautifully. Out of every dollar that we pay, as Ben says, nearly 60 cents comes from the investment returns. So we could not take it more seriously that managing risk to protect assets and achieving these returns is our fiduciary duty, but it's more than our fiduciary duty. It is something that we are personally and professionally committed to, because taking care of our members is so important. So these investment beliefs bring together some ideas. It's in a way wrong to just pick out 5, because the first investment belief is that liabilities must drive what happens with assets and asset allocation. And that really is the pension buck. Who's going to pay those pensions, and what's CalPERS' role in that? But the second idea around sustainability is woven right through all of the investment beliefs. And there's a good reason for that. Although we have to be a very short-term investor, because guess what? Pensions need to be paid monthly, and CalPERS puts out over $20 billion in cash every year. People can't pay the rent with an IOU. They can't go to the grocery store or buy things for their grandchildren or pay bills. We've got to have that cash on a monthly basis for the members. So CalPERS, unlike some other investors, is actually quite short-term. I mean, we've got to have a section of the assets really directed towards putting those pension payments out every single month. But we're also very long-term, because people joining the fund now may have 60, 70 years before their time in retirement ends. So we think of the fund really as perpetual. And we're not only long-term, we're permanent. So the second investment belief really sums that up. It says having this long-term investment horizon is an advantage. Means we can take positions where there's a liquidity or the returns are going to be harvested over a very long period. That's good. But it's also, the investment belief says, a responsibility. We have a responsibility to advocate with policymakers, with managers, with companies, to make sure that that long-term approach is aligned through the market. So that's one investment belief that really reflects this thinking about sustainability. There's also number 3, says that the CalPERS board's decisions and management decisions will reflect stakeholder views, where that's consistent with fiduciary duty. CalPERS fiduciary duty sits in the California Constitution, and there's nowhere higher to go. So ensuring that prudence, the care, minimizing costs to employers that's in the Constitution, that cannot be overridden. But engagement with stakeholders, understanding their perspectives, learning from their insight is very important to CalPERS, and that's why there's an investment belief there. Next, this was very innovative in the day. CalPERS states that there are 3 forms of capital that matter to long-term value creation. There's financial capital, which is, of course, the traditional day job to manage. There's human capital, and there's physical capital. And that's really how CalPERS thinks about ESG. E for us is physical capital, S for us is human capital, and F and G is the governance of financial capital. The other 2 examples are obvious. Risk for us is multifaceted, and climate change is called out as an example. And finally, whether it's internally for CalPERS or with our managers or with the companies we invest in, teamwork is essential, and diversity and inclusion underpin all of that. How do we get this done? Well, we identified in the strategic plan 3 channels. The first is that we need to be able to advocate with policymakers and regulators. Secondly, that we can use our ability to deploy capital to ensure we're engaging with companies and managers. And thirdly, we need to take the relevant elements into our internal investment decision-making. And that's where we have our 3-legged stool of the strategy: advocacy, engagement, and integration. And all of those we know are going to be more effective if we can work in partnership. We have learned as we've gone along that this is a very big agenda. The strategic plan is very focused with the priorities, but the new organizational structure that we have really allows the executive office to pick up a new role on advocacy and partnerships, which means that there's an enterprise-wide approach now with Marcy in the lead for that work. And in the investment office, global equity, with Samiso's leadership, will continue to lead on engagement, and sustainable investments led by Beth will continue to push forward the very important work on integration. The 6 priorities, you can see they're set out here, but we're just going to focus on 2 examples. The first is climate change. So CalPERS signed up for something called the Montreal Pledge, which meant that we said we would map our carbon footprint in global equity. And Divya Mankikar, an investment officer at the time, did this extraordinary piece of data analysis on our 11,000 or so companies to find that less than 100 were responsible for the majority of the emissions. And with that insight, and there's a good example where data drive decisions, we were able to share that data with other asset owners and investors and say, look, if there's only 100 or so companies responsible for the bulk of emissions, we could have a very focused strategy on making sure that those companies get aligned with Paris. So where are we now? We launched, and thank you, Betty Yee was there for us at the One Planet Summit to launch this. Climate Action 100 is now the world's largest investor action initiative ever attempted, has investors representing $35 trillion in assets. And the companies that we're engaging are more or less equally spread between North America, Europe, and Asia. So it's a very global group. You can look at the website for Climate Action 100 to get all the detail. We've just published our first report showing some very major carbon emitters agreeing to what we're asking for. And some of the examples are up here, but they're in the oil sector, mining, cement, energy, even Nestle. So, you know, people who make chocolate biscuits also have a role here in their supply chain. The other area, and Ben said earlier how proud CalPERS is of the work that we've been leading in climate change. This has been acknowledged by the media, and I think we're just flagging 3 examples. The Financial Times, which has recognized Climate Action 100 Plus as a giant step forwards. The Economist, likewise, a very conservative publication and very well respected. And finally, in the mainstream, Time magazine recognized CalPERS this summer among its list of 15 women leading the fight, alongside Greta Thunberg and Christiana Figueres, who was the coordinator for the Paris Agreement. So let me now turn to Samiso to give another example of how the CalPERS strategy, the approach that we have, is really generating results. So Samiso, over to you.
Thank you, Anne. Good afternoon, the Investment Committee. Simiso Nzima, Investment Director, Global Equities. On diversity and inclusion, the numbers speak for themselves. We have had 53% of the companies that we engaged since July 2017 adding a diverse director to their board, so the element of diversity that they didn't have. This is 361 companies of 682. About 200 companies which we are actively engaging with right now in different stages of engagement in terms of enhancing their diversity. And again, we expect that those active engagements will result in additional appointments of diverse candidates to the boards of corporate companies that we're focused on. And we have actually met one of the KPIs for the S&P 500, where we're looking at least getting all companies in the S&P 500 to have at least an element of diversity, to have gender diversity on their board. Where the diversity engagements are not working, we've actually used our investor rights to hold boards accountable. So we've voted against 255 directors at 97 companies just this past proxy season. If you look at last proxy season, that number was 468 directors we voted against 845 companies. So that number is actually coming down, which shows that companies which previously were not open to this idea, they're actually now opening up and doing the stuff that we're asking them to do. And again, on diversity and inclusion, really our approach is based on the empirical evidence that shows that companies which are more diverse tend to have better financial outcomes, higher innovation, and better spend on R&D. So this really is about returns. As Ben said at the beginning of this presentation, this is about sustainability of returns. In terms of the media impact, again, a number of media outlets have picked up on the work that we're doing in this space. Those are some of the highlights, but there are a number of them, not just those two that are put out there. And just this past month, CalPERS was a recipient of the 2019 Silicon Valley Leading the Way Award. And this is an award which was given for the strong leadership that CalPERS has done in terms of trying to get corporate boards to diversify. So there's really a lot of recognition that CalPERS is getting in terms of the work that we're doing on diversity, and we'll continue to hold companies accountable and try and get as many diverse candidates on company boards as possible. I'll hand it back to Anne now.
Thank you. Thank you. We just want to finish with 3 other forms of recognition, which CalPERS is very proud of, not just in the media, but globally. PRI has established, this is the UN-supported Principles for Responsible Investment, has formed a global leaders group. There's one asset owner in the United States, which is a member, and Teresa Taylor was at PRI in person this year to stand and receive a standing ovation in the auditorium and take a bow. So this is really a very important recognition for us that our peers see CalPERS leadership. Likewise, on the very tough issues of how we're going to manage data and targets and methodologies on climate change, which is really tough stuff, the United Nations Secretary General personally invited our Chief Executive, Marcy Frost, for CalPERS to join the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. Again, CalPERS is the first US fund to join that group. And finally, another sign that the wide range of CalPERS' commitment to sustainability is recognised is an invitation for Marcy, CalPERS CEO, to join the Vatican Council on Inclusive Capitalism, which builds on prior work at the Vatican around climate change. So let me leave it there. There are 2 other slides for you to look at, which give you examples of the partnerships that we have, both as members and as having board seats, and also with a wide range of regulatory bodies where we sit on the board. Staff members like James Andrus and others are taking board seats and really speaking for CalPERS in the global regulatory arena. So the strategy, the philosophy that we have is that we have ambition, but we are humble. We know that we're in the foothills of a very long climb on many of these issues, but there's a very old saying, which Dan actually has on his email signature box, and it is as follows: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So the work that we do in partnerships is because CalPERS not only needs to go far, we intend to go far. So I know that Beth, Samiso, Ben, and I will be glad to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Middleton.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is actually going to be more of a comment than a question. But first, I want to congratulate the team for all the work that you have done. And I think it's incredibly important work that we're doing. Recently, at one of the board meetings where we heard a discussion on diversity and inclusion, I asked the question as to whether or not those corporate board diversity and inclusion efforts included LGBTQ identified individuals, and was very pleased by the response. Shortly thereafter, I attended the National Association of Corporate Directors annual conference. During that conference, there were multiple panel discussions on the question of diversity and inclusion. Not one of those panels included an out LGBT individual. Not one of those panels included a discussion of issues around individuals being out as LGBTQ either on their panel or in their organization, nor did it happen in any of the other discussions of the seminars that I sat in, and I sat in on 13. And in most of those, diversity and inclusion was talked about at least once during the panel. Lastly, Deloitte has done an incredible amount of work, most particularly in establishing long-term metrics on diversity and inclusion. None of those metrics include LGBTQ. If we are going to step up our game in this area, I think CalPERS is going to have to take a lead. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to thank you, Ann Simpson, to say that CalPERS principles include these various, including LGBT, in our definition of diversity. And when we were pulling together the refresher on the research, we had a presentation from Credit Suisse on some very important research they'd done around finding indicators for board members who were out as members of the community, and finding that that was associated with improved financial performance. And we'd be very glad to share that with the board for those who weren't there at the time. But it really bears out, I think, an intuition or an insight, which is that diverse boards should bring a whole range of perspectives that are going to really help with both risk and return.
Thank you. Ms. Taylor.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I want to thank you, Ann, Samiso, and Beth, for all the work you've done. I've been here since, if I go back on this, since 2014, so I was at the very end of when we put it together. But I'm very appreciative of the work you've done, that you continue to do on this. I'm looking forward, because I know how difficult it is. This is one of the subjects that comes up often when I go to PRI or elsewhere, for having some sort of data reporting, whether that's on climate change, diversity, getting corporations to report back to us. That information is difficult, and I'm aware of that, and I hope that I know that there are several different data reporting companies that we're looking at, but overall, I know that as CalPERS is, the norm breaker doing this, I'm hoping that we can come up with a standard across the country. I know they have it in Europe, sort of. It's better than ours right now. So I would love to hope to see that CalPERS participates in some sort of standard across the country. I also wanted to congratulate Anne, because she didn't mention this herself, but Anne Simpson was the woman that was recognized in the Times magazine 15 Women on Climate Change. So I wanted to make sure that everybody recognized that. And finally, I just had a question. So we do a proxy voting season every season, and now we have new SEC rules. Could I get just a high level, maybe you haven't had time to look at it yet, a high level overview of how that makes you feel like that's going to impact us?
Thank you, Smith Onzima, CalPERS staff. So the rules haven't gone right now they're still in the proposal phase. So we'll be commenting on those. But again, I think, there are rules which affect the proxy advisory firms, which will really affect in terms of the research that we get from the proxy advisory firms, the timing of that research, and potentially could increase the cost of us acquiring that research, which really does affect how we evaluate some of these proxies. Again, we use our own governance and sustainability principles and the investment beliefs to make decisions, but we use these, the proxy advisory firms to really look at their research and that point us faster in terms of achieving those, arriving at those decisions. There's also the potential that it could actually end up resulting in one proxy advisory firm surviving instead of the two main proxy advisory firms which control 95% of the market. And if one of them ends up going under, it means really then we have a situation again, our costs could go higher, or the voting platforms that we use to cast our votes, because again, we use the technology which is hosted at one of the proxy advisory firms. So that's a risk on the research side. Then there's a risk on the shareholder submission. So the two elements to the shareholder submission issue, there's the increase in the amount of holdings that you should have to submit a shareholder. Right now, it's $2,000 worth of stock that you've held for 1 year. With the proposals, that changes that if it's $2,000 worth of stock held for at least 3 years, so between 2,000 and 14,999, and then $15,000 worth of stock held for 2 years, or $25,000 worth of stock held for 1 year. That will not probably affect us, but it will affect a lot other, smaller investors who've been, really helpful in identifying some of the emerging issues, because again, some of the things which we take for granted now started as emerging issues and were filed by smaller shareholders. That doesn't affect us that much. But there's the issue of resubmitting of shareholder proposals, where really right now, if a proposal gets less than 3% the first year, then it won't be eligible to be resubmitted for the next 3 years. So it is 3, 6, and 10%. That's the current resubmission threshold. 3% first year, 6% the second time it's submitted, and 10% the third time. The proposal is to increase those to say 5% the first year, 15% the second year, and 25% the third year. and that will sort of constrain the ability of investors, including us, really, when you think about any emerging issues, because no new emerging issue get 25% the first time. Most of these issues, even on climate risk reporting in the US, they're getting really low shareholder support in the beginning. So there are those issues that we have to think about. But again, there's a comment period. We signed on to a letter from the Council of Institutional Investors asking the SEC to increase the comment period from 60 days to 120 days so that we have enough time to really analyze the impact on this on our ability to be responsible fiduciaries.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Paquin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for this report. We also remember the start of this process, so it's very gratifying to see how well it's been implemented, and still more work to come, but glad to see the progress so far. So I had two questions, and the first relates to a couple of comments the controller made earlier this morning regarding diversity with the private asset classes. And we have been such a leader with the public companies, and I recognize it's a different structure, different ownership structure, governance structure. But is there any thought to using some of the strategies, lessons learned from the public sector and the private sector?
If I may, I plan to address this question in closed session this afternoon.
Okay. All right, thank you. The other question I had was, I think the new org chart you showed on slide 7. So I'm just curious how this works as far as integrating the partnership work with what Beth does with the integration into the portfolio and what Samiso is doing with engagements and proxies. Because I remember a couple of years ago, there was a different org chart being implemented then as well to a sustainable investments. I think we called it corporate governance at the time. And there was somewhat of a couple of missed opportunities because it wasn't really flowing from one team to the next team. So how do you plan to ensure that there's no hiccups this time?
Yes, so that's a very good question. That's one of the very first thing we thought about it very hard, how to address this potential challenge. One of the ways we're going to have a steering committee. So we'll be Marcy, myself, Marcy from the CEO office, myself from the investment office, plus then Avenue, then plus Beth, Samiso, and Anne will meet regularly to talk about the initiatives from, if you view it as 3 pillars, advocacy, engagement, and integration. So we'll make sure that the collaboration among the 3 pillars is seamless as possible.
And will we still be nimble enough to respond quickly to certain opportunities that come up with our partnership groups?
Yes.
Sometimes they don't give a lot of time.
Yeah, so that's the goal, exactly.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Perez.
Thank you. Samiso, on page 11 to 15, where the last bullet, you said you voted against, or we voted against 255 directors. In my understanding, where that we voted against the appointment or the selection of a director to that board?
So companies have the annual elections. Most directors are, elected annually to company board. So we voted against the election of either the chairman of the board or the chairman of the board and the entire nominating and governance committee, because this is a diversity issue and about nomination to the board.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
And then I just want to acknowledge Ben's courage and his opening statement regarding reminding, or his appeal to the public to work within our, we have to work within our constraints, and we need to earn our returns, not so much anything else. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. Ms. Oliveros.
Thank you. I'm just curious if there's any correlation that we've found between our sustainability strategy and our investment performance.
I would say too early to tell, but as Anne mentioned earlier on in her presentation, when we engage the comprehensive, the theory, the research, the review of all academic studies, with the help from the professors from University of Columbia and UC Davis, we found, if I remember correctly, we found strong evidence behind G, the ESG, the G part. E and S, I believe, just because it's so new, the lack of data, so it's too early to tell.
Thank you. And then,
Just a second.
Oh, sorry.
Ms. Rickman has.
oh, sorry.
I was just going to add one additional thing to Beth Richtman, Sustainable Investments, which is that, with a lot of our efforts, we haven't fully integrated or even rolled out sort of significant integration process into our investment decision making. We are in the early stages within different asset classes, so it really depends. On real assets, for instance, we have for several years now been using the ESG matrix that Paul mentioned to make sure that we were identifying risks to help us achieve better risk-adjusted returns. And also with the energy optimization initiative he mentioned earlier as well, that's a place where we are actively looking for opportunities to make more money because we're integrating an environmental sort of opportunity lens related to energy. So
That gets to the question I was going to ask, which is our sustainability strategy applied across all asset classes in a way that's even?
So I would say that our asset class strategies are very different. Mm-hmm. So if you think about global equity, which is index oriented versus, and also largely internally managed, versus private equity, where, as discussed earlier today, we're largely investing through general partnerships and commingled funds where we have limited governance, versus our real assets where we have very strong governance, as Paul mentioned, and we often have sort of accounts of one, where we're the only client of the general partner. And that is in some cases. In other cases, we're the only LP in the fund. And so it has to be different because of those types of, differences amongst the investment strategies and also the types of assets we're invested in. So, one project we're looking at right now is doing some research on the types of indexes available and what potentially you could think about related to ESG integration. We're still relatively early in that work, but that is something for an index-oriented strategy that you would need to think about. Versus on a real assets, you're looking at individual, chunky investments that maybe several $100 million, maybe even $1 billion that are fixed in a specific environmental and social context in a location that you have to underwrite in a different way than you would looking at an index.
But is the sustainability strategy applied across all the asset classes, or is it not considered in some cases?
So our governance and sustainability principles are part of the total funds policy. So they are our principles across the fund. However, the way that they're actually acted on varies asset class by asset class just because of the nuances of the asset class.
So just to add on to that, so the answer is yes, it is applied to all asset classes, but exactly the different asset class, the readiness, think about either advocacy or engagement or integration, the readiness for each asset class along the three pillars are different. So in principle, we are applying to all asset classes by taking into the uniqueness of each asset class.
I think that would be helpful to see going forward in terms of how we apply it to each asset class. I recognize it's very different in how they're treated. And then just getting back to the 6 pillars, I saw diversity and inclusion, 6 priorities for external. But what about internal? Are we also prioritizing diversity and inclusion?
The answer is a resounding yes.
Thank you.
Anything else, Ms. Oliveros?
No, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Seeing nobody other requests. Anything else on this item? All right. We do have a number of requests from the audience. I'm going to call you up in pairs, 2 at a time. You'll have up to 2 minutes to make your comments, please, due to the large number of requests. And I encourage you to not repeat the person in front of you. Please offer some new comments when you come up. And just please don't read us the status quo email that was sent out. I mean, I got 70 of the exact same thing, so please give us some new information. First, we have Sandy Emerson and Deborah Sylvie. Please come forward. The microphones are turned on for you. Give your name and affiliation for the record, please.
I'm Sandy Emerson. I'm the board chair of Fossil Free California. And we have just released reports showing the effect of staying invested in fossil fuels by 3 state pension funds, CalPERS, CalSTRS, and Colorado's PARA. Collectively, PERS, STIRS, and PARA would have been $19 billion richer if they had divested from fossil fuels 10 years ago. For CalPERS, that's $11.9 billion, $5.5 billion for STIRS, and $1.77 for PARA. These studies were performed by Toronto-based media and analysis firm Corporate Knights, and the methodology for each fund was exactly the same. For the publicly disclosed portions of the portfolio for the public equities, returns were compared on a quarter-by-quarter basis with fossil fuels and without. So it was a comparison of 40 quarters. The portfolios, the return comparison reflected all inflows and outflows to the funds, including dividends, and they were rebalanced quarterly. As you know, the UC system recently resolved to divest its endowment and pension funds, $83 billion worth, resolved to divest from fossil fuels. Staying invested in fossil fuels might make sense if fossil fuel investments were making money, but they've been losing. They've been the worst performing sector of the S&P 500 for the past decade. The percent in your portfolio has declined from 17% 10 years ago to about 8% now. And that's based on a decline in value. The investments that you hold have remained fairly constant. So divesting can improve returns. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Deborah Silvey, a CalPERS retiree, and I want to speak to what this Corporate Knight study means for me and each of my fellow CalPERS pension holders. We have been told at these board meetings that continued investment in the fossil fuel sector is a sound growth strategy for the present and for the next several years, but this study underscores the extent to which the sector is losing strength. Because of this market decline in the energy sector over the past 10 years, CalPERS has lost money for its members by delaying the inevitable shift away from fossil fuel investments. There's a chart on page 6 in the study that gives a clear picture of the lost value per member. And as you'll see there, it's a very simple chart. It's based on an analysis of public security filings over the past 10 years. It's estimated that CalPERS would have generated more than $6,000 additional value per member if the fund had divested its fossil fuel stocks, including the entire energy sector, along with other securities with more than 10% fossil fuel revenue. But even if we include a narrower slice of the market, the energy sector plus other securities with more than 50% fossil fuel revenue, CalPERS would have generated more than $4,800 additional value per member had the fund divested. So it's important to note that the report understates the fossil fuel holdings and opportunity costs since it covers only public equities, but not private equities or bonds. For example, BlackRock has lost its clients an estimated $90 billion over the last decade because of its investments in fossil fuels, according to a report from the Institute for Energy, Economics, and Financial Analysis. In fact, BlackRock reports a trend toward funds with less fossil fuel exposure is the fastest growing fund for them. So it's time for us to move money to safer investments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next up is Sarah Theis and Ben Clare.
Hello, my name is Sarah Theis. As a CalPERS retiree, I'm a stakeholder. I'm also a member of Fossil Free California. As you know, I attend these meetings regularly and regularly comment on the latest developments demonstrating that the fossil fuel industry is in financial decline. Others in FFCA have been doing the same thing for several years. With the report that we released earlier this month, we present additional robust evidence of this decline. The results are consistent among all the three funds studied. They're consistent with an analysis done in the last year of the New York State Retirement Fund, a study done a couple of years ago of the Massachusetts State Pension Fund. They're consistent with UC's decision to divest for, as Sandy stated, purely financial reasons. This data is not cherry-picked. It's, as stated, it's part of a 10-year trend. You're free to test the data yourselves because the data file is available. I think it's in the link to the materials we sent. And the study author is also available. His name is on the press release that we sent. I believe you received individually this material, I think last week, and then we sent it to Mr. Fechner and other people at the end of October. So given this, I don't understand why the board has not yet engaged the staff on this topic. I strongly request that the board agendize the topic of continued investment in the fossil fuel industries. If there are reasons not to reallocate the fund in this respect, PERS members such as myself who've contributed to part of the fund deserve to hear. It's time to get answers from the CIO and staff, especially given the fund's concern about PERS's underfunded status. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Benjamin Clare. I'm a fourth-year student at UC Davis studying climate change. I'm a future stakeholder, and I'm here to emphasize the fact that investing in fossil fuels is simply a bad financial move. As previously mentioned, the UC system understands this, as just 2 months ago, UC officials announced divestment from fossil fuels, and I really want to highlight this point. Following the divestment announcement, the UC Chief Investment Officer, Jagdeep Singh, published a piece in the Los Angeles Times stating that, quote, "We believe hanging on to fossil fuel assets is a financial risk," unquote. He also added that there were, quote, "more attractive investment opportunities," unquote, in new energy sources, meaning renewables like wind and solar. We know that fossil fuels are causing climate change, and this endangers my own future. We know that climate change causes intensified natural disasters. As we saw last year, 85 people in California lost their lives from the Paradise wildfires. This is a matter of life and death, and divesting from fossil fuels can save lives, especially within California. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, Lynn Knitter and Costanza Gonzalo.
Hello, I'm Lynn Nittler. I'm a retired teacher of 33 years with healthcare at CalPERS. Notwithstanding the report that we heard earlier today, I am still incredulous that CalSTRS is invested in fossil fuel stocks at this late date. It is clear that investments in fossil fuels are unwise financially, as the Corporate Knights report shows. The extraction of those fossil fuels is destructive to our land, air, and water. Many communities across our country are left with polluted drinking water, illnesses, and degraded land as the fossil fuel companies move on to new fracking sites. Worse still, fossil fuels release CO2 as they burn, altering our atmosphere. We have literally changed the climate such that our children have taken to the streets in defense of a livable planet. As Greta Thunberg says, how dare you? CalPERS prefers engagement over divestment. I suggest it's too late. The only engagement that will stop the disasters already escalating around the globe is to stop burning fossil fuels. That is, stop drilling and mining now. We are already nearing irreversible tipping points. The time you waste on engagement keeps us from making the transition to renewable energy and, frankly, dooms us. CalPERS is in a position to usher in a new era. If you divest the 17.6% of your portfolio currently in fossil fuels and invest in clean renewable energy that propels us into a more sustainable future, you lead the way for others to follow. Scientists, some 11,000 of them just last week, give us just 10 years to make that shift. So you have a choice. You can lead us to our destruction or to a brighter future. If you have children or care about them, the choice is obvious. What are you waiting for?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Costanza Gonzalo. I'm a UC Davis student. I'm studying environmental policy analysis and planning, and I think my colleagues have already mentioned the economic parts of the argument, but I really want to emphasize the moral part of it and emphasize that divesting from fossil fuels is the good path in history, and you all have investment power, which is really powerful in our market and our policy, and I think it's very important to change that to more economically and more morally better choices that we have. And as I'm graduating in June, I want to work in a place that will give me funds later, that will protect me, and I don't want to work in a place that doesn't care about my future or my generation. So I really think that divesting in fossil fuels is a very important thing in this problem. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Next up, I have Sheila Thorne and Robert Gerwing and Christine Nelson. You can all three come forward, please. You're the last three.
You want me to go? My name is Chris Nelson. I'm a retired public health nurse in Butte County. I just wanted to relate to you. I talked about the campfire when I was here in March as part of my discussion, my input about climate change and what we need to be doing. But, you know, my colleagues who are competent people who I worked with for a dozen years, and I know how great they were. They are now reduced to nostalgia, PTSD, spending all of their time on the past. They're ruined, and they have retirements. They had insurance. They've moved to Oregon, but our community, people are still living in RVs. There is still not water for the people of Paradise. It can't be redone. You can't undo some of these things. And for me, the only performance indicators that are going to matter is that we become carbon neutral on CalPERS. The investments that you have, really, when you talk about course correction and volatility, you need to make the changes. And we can't do it for you, and we count on you. We get these rosy announcements for you, but we retirees know what's going on. And this is, Hegel used a words dogmatic slumber. That's the problem here. You guys have got to change, and you have to not keep patting yourselves on the back for what you've done. You haven't done enough. And we want to see climate change not be as horrible as it's going to be if people don't wake up and make the movements soon.
Thank you.
My name is Sheila Thorne, and I'm a retired member of CFA and also a member of RPEA. And global warming is damaging the Earth now at an unprecedented pace, according to the September meeting of the International Panel on Climate Change, even worse than previous projections. Global warming is so far advanced, a tipping point has already been reached. They now predict that 100-year floods will become annual events by 2050 in some, including Los Angeles and San Diego. Lancet reports that human exposure to fire has already doubled since 2000, and by the end of the century, almost all the world's population could be exposed to mosquito-borne diseases once limited to the tropics, according to PLOS Tropical Diseases Report. In the face of climate chaos, how can any of us continue on as normal? How can you continue to uphold shareholder engagement when, despite years of this policy, U.S. oil companies trying to grab what they can before being regulated and legislated out of existence still account for 60% of world growth in oil and gas production, expanding 4 times more than any other country, and ignoring climate action goals? How can you continue to risk our pensions in fossil fuel industries that are not only destroying the world as we know it, but are losing money? How can you continue to invest in a sector of the economy whose decline is likely to snowball as the world transitions, warns Mark Carney, governor of the Bank of England, creating financial chaos and bankruptcy, rather than invest in an expanding and profitable green future? Please do your fiduciary duty.
Thank you.
Hi. Good afternoon. My name is Robert Gerling. I am a retiree. I'm a legislative representative for the Emeritus Retired Faculty Association and Faculty and Staff Association of the California State University. I'm an Emeritus Professor of Business Administration. And first of all, I wanted to thank the board and to thank CalPERS for making my retirement possible, and for that check that I get every month, which is due to the fact that you as a group and CalPERS as an organization and the staff have been so careful and thoughtful with the management of the resources which have been put at our disposal. I'm also started something called the Sustainable Enterprise Conference 15 years ago, which we brought together leaders in education, community, business, and government to talk about opportunities for investment in alternative technologies and so forth in the future. And I think that that's something that I'd like to see CalPERS look more closely at, is the issue of alternative forms of investment. I also wanted to share with you some information that was I received recently. It's a recently released study. It's called Analyzing the Financial Risk of Holding Fossil Fuel Assets in the CalPERS Portfolio. It was prepared by Professor Claire Brown's lab at the Institute for Research in Labor and Economics at the University of California. And the study documents what we've heard about from some of the previous speakers in terms of the fact that energy is the lowest performing sector in the S&P 500 with negative returns as opposed to the benchmark return of 355%. That's a huge difference. You're talking about benchmarks earlier, and I think that relates to that. According to the report's projections, though, if CalPERS does new companies which are heavily invested in fossil fuels, we will be holding potentially stranded assets that both underperform other investments and contribute significantly to the global carbon emissions. Can I just have one more minute, please? Thank you. I think it's really important that we as a group, I mean, we're citizens, we're the people of California, the greatest state in the nation. We have the responsibility to lead. And as citizens, we have the responsibility to take on the challenge and to show other countries and other people across the nation what we can do as a group. I don't want us to make the mistake that was made in terms of failure to divest in PG&E. I think that the future is with alternative energies. I don't think it can divest overnight. It's something that has to be done gradually, but to begin that study is something that is important to do right now, and perhaps to create a committee of CalPERS to look into this and to provide monthly reports on that divestment. Thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you again for all that you do. I really, I mean, it's service to the people of California and service to people of the world that you are doing. So I really honor each and every one of you, and thank you again.
Thank you. We have one more request to speak, Vanessa Warright.
Thank you all very much. My name is Vanessa Warheit. I'm the Executive Director of Fossil Free California, and I'd like to speak to you both in that capacity, but also on behalf of my mother, Virginia Warheit, who's a CalPERS retiree, and she couldn't be here today because of health issues. You've heard from others about the data that is now available showing the ongoing losses to CalPERS from not divesting from fossil fuels. Your fiduciary duty requires managing risk and securing returns for all members, young and old. And the good news is that divesting no presents a choice between short-term and long-term needs. Divestment serves both and allows you to fulfill your fiduciary duty. Today, fossil fuels are no longer a blue chip investment. I know it's hard to wrap our heads around that when that's been the reality all of our lives, but that is the case today. They bond-like returns with highly volatile, equity-like risk. Meanwhile, the planet is literally on fire, and funds like CalPERS represent in very real terms our last best hope to avert a global crisis unmatched in human history. For all the talk of ESG leadership, the fund's engagement with the fossil fuel industry has failed, even under the old rules at the SEC, and we are now out of time. You need to act with great speed and great courage. I urge you on behalf of the human race, the species also facing extinction, to divest all but a small amount of your investments in fossil fuels. As the gentleman mentioned earlier, you are legally able to continue engaging with only $2,000 invested over a year or two in any given fund without exposing billions of dollars to such high levels of risk. My mother, Virginia, I would love to speak for a moment on her behalf, if you don't mind.
Quickly, please.
Thank you. She retired 10 years ago from the city of Palo Alto as a senior city planner, and there are two things she wants me to tell you. First, and I'm now channeling my mother, fossil fuels are not a good financial investment. You have obligations, present and future, and we need to use all of the information available to us to choose the best investments. And you now have information showing that these are not a good investment. Secondly, we paid into this fund. This is our hard-earned money you are investing for, and it is foolhardy to keep investing in fossil fuels when they have hidden the true cost of the climate crisis for decades, and they're continuing to fight efforts to transition to a clean energy economy. It really bothers me that my money is being used for something that is so destructive. I demand that you align investments with the physics of the climate crisis and the goals of the Paris Climate Accord and follow the lead of the UC Regents and divest immediately from fossil fuels. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for your comments. We move on to item 11C, CalPERS for California Annual Update. Mr. B.
While we're waiting for Dan to get ready, I just want to make one comment. Earlier on, we mentioned that every year we pay out about $24 billion to our retirees. That's of CalPERS for California. Most of the $24 billion are consumed and spent in California.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Agenda item 11C is an information item on CalPERS annual report on investments in California. It originally came to the committee as a consent item, but is being brought back to the committee as an information item upon request. The consultant who prepared the report is here to answer any questions as needed, and in the interest of time and approaching lunch, I'll pause there and happy to take any questions.
Seeing none, good call.
Thank you.
That brings us to agenda 12, summary of committee direction. Mr. Meng.
Yep. I noted two. One from Ms. Taylor early regarding the doing part of the real asset program review. You mentioned making sure that our managers are in compliance with the new law in terms of sexual harassment prevention. And the second note was from Ms. Oliveras when we were talking about the policy revision of the private assets. So the comment is to make it more clear that this is not to get rid of the area's expertise, actually is moving that to somewhere else. So I noticed these two items.
All right, very good. Seeing no other requests, This meeting is adjourned. We will start closed session at 1:45.